welcome to the Springboard podcast by Bakerview Church. My name is Jonathan. I'm here with Jeff. Hello, Jeff. How's it going?
Hello, Jonathan. It is going well.
Good to hear. We're a couple pastors at Bakerview Church who enjoy talking theology and life and all sorts of things. And this is a podcast where we spring off of the sermon from the week. And so we get to talk further on it. And so this is episode 23 now. So we're making our way through. And Jeff, you preached this last Sunday or this last weekend. And we are working through a series called Work, Rest, and Play. It's a very practical series, kind of getting at these big questions of what it means to be human and how to kind of arrange our life as humans and as followers of Jesus, which is very helpful now as life kind of feels disoriented for a lot of people. And this last sermon, you talked about being priests and rulers in the garden. So do you want to just give a brief overview of the essence of that? What does that mean for us? Why does that matter for us today?
Yeah, I borrowed the language, as I said in the sermon, from N.T. Wright and his book After You Believe. And his kind of idea of the image of God in a nutshell is that we're to reflect God to the world and the world back to God, kind of thing. And in order to reflect God to the world, we need to exercise that rule that he gave humanity to exercise over the living creatures, over the world. And in order to, so that makes us a ruler collectively. And then to reflect the world back to God is a priestly function. This is what priests do. We gather what the world has been thinking, has been doing, and we offer it to God. It's a if we want to use sacrificial language, I'm not big on that, but it's certainly worshipful or praise kind of servicing back to God all of that is and all of that we've done, kind of thing. And so there you have your kind of your two sides of the same coin. You have your priestly duties to bring the world to God, and your ruling duties to bring God to the world. And that puts humanity actually in a very special place in creation.
Yeah, I love that language and that framework. It's very helpful just to lay out what we are to do and to kind of put some defining claims of what it means to be human. But what I love about it is how much it elevates creation as a whole.
Yeah.
That in this sermon, I believe the last sermon, you brought up the Westminster Confession, so we won't go into that again on this springboard. But this idea that the focus of being made in the image of God is so much about humans and God and that relationship. And rightly so. We are made in the image of God. He claims us very good. We have these specific rules and or responsibilities or mandates as humans that separate us from the rest of creation. But in doing that hierarchy of God, humans, the rest of creation is not incorrect, but I think we just get so hung up on the first two. Okay, what does it mean to be an image bearer, and how does that just reflect God? We forget this other piece of reflecting the world back to God, as you're talking about, or as N.T. Wright mentions, and our relationship with creation and the massive part that plays in what it means to be human. So I just think that's crucial for us. And I thought maybe it would be helpful on this podcast to talk a little bit about a couple of there's a few views of that we can kind of separate what it means to be made in the image of God that the church and Christians are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think listeners, most of you, if I define these, you'll probably have heard it in some sort of sermon or teaching, but you might not be familiar with the names of the views. So I'll just walk us through them, and then we can discuss a little bit about each of them. So the first one, which is the most common, is the substantive. Okay, so it's a fancy word, but it really just means that humans carry in their soul or in their being the essence of God, kind of the nature of God. So when we ask the question, who is God? What is he like? That also is a question we can say, okay, as humans, what are we reflecting then? Because whatever God is like, we're made in that image. we reflect God. And what is beautiful about this view is that it makes the universal claim that all humans are made in the image of God. So it's not about being Christian or being a human in a certain generation, but all humans have that. So just right away with that, Jeff, what does that do for our practical living as Christians when we see all humans made in the image of God, whether or not they acknowledge it? How does that affect kind of our discipleship and our mission as the church?
Yeah, I remember once Bruxy Cavey came to Axe Seminaries to speak at a chapel, and this was kind of his focus. And I never will forget when he said, the human being is the most sacred of all creation because of this idea. However you define image of God, it's applied to humanity only, and that makes it the human, not the Christian, but the human, a very sacred thing. And so if you consider how Moses was called to a bush that was burning, and removed his sandals and like came with reverence to the presence of God. The human is the very kind of presence of God being made in the image of God. And so we should, when we come near a person, we're coming near the most precious thing that God has made. And so I don't want to elevate, as you said, the idea isn't to say nothing else is as important as human beings. Those kind of structures I don't think are helpful. But it is significant to mention that God made humanity in a very, very special way, and didn't categorize one over the other. It's more of a collective. But when we're within each other's presence, we're in the presence of God, as He manifests Himself through creation in that way. And so I think it's huge, as we don't just look at our brothers and sisters, our fellow church attenders, whatever, as being special in God's eyes. It's our whole neighborhood. It's everyone in the city.
Wow. Yeah. That just changes so much of our view of other people, and how much more do we need that, and that reminder that everyone is made in the image of God. And a fascinating thing is this view is really kind of the chief motivation behind, I'm not sure the time, but when universal human rights became much more of a possibility, that they became something that governments and countries and organizations fought for. Much of that was based off of this fundamental idea of equality, that we are all on that level playing field right away, that there's something unique and special and important about each person, and that each person matters. That I think you talked about in your sermon, this idea of be and do, and the balance we need as humans of that. But just to acknowledge that just the fact that humans are being, that they exist, that they matter. And so I think that's an incredibly important thing to acknowledge, that as Christians, we pioneered that movement, or hundreds of years ago, and today are we still doing that? Is human rights something that's on our mind today as the church? Because this view of the image of God would say, yes, it should be. And
Absolutely. And the language that is often, or was often, used in these kinds of, especially in activist kind of seasons in history, where human rights in some way were being fought for. The language that was being used is souls. Soul is kind of our way of talking about the essence of that image of God within us. We all have a soul, so to speak, is maybe what we were getting at there. The danger in that, of course, is that we focus the image of God on the invisible quality or the invisible substance or essence within us, and we very quickly can ignore the external, the physical reality of who we are. And so we need to be careful there too, that we don't let this universal humanity in the image of God be carried away to, it's just what's within us that counts, and God's going to whisk those away from this external physical kind of setting. I know that's really not the topic here, but that is the slope that people kind of slide on as soon as they go here. It's the whole person, and that's what soul actually means. It comes psyche, literally means like a living thing. We sometimes translate it in English living soul, sometimes life or living thing. And so it's that living essence within us, the fact that we're living, we have that breath of life kind of thing. That's what that's what kind of translates into this idea of this substantive image bearing that humanity has.
Yeah, that's great. And that one of the views we'll get to, the third one, will, I think, play into some of that. And so the second view, and this is probably the least common, I don't know if a lot of people would say they hold to this view like on purpose, but as far as I understand, it's called the relational view of the image of God, which sounds great. Relationship is important. But a focus of this one is that it does elevate humans to this idea that because we are rational, logical beings, we're able to have a relationship with God because we can think it up, if that makes sense. Like we can understand that. And so that's why. And that people that aren't aware that they have a relationship with God and haven't logically said, yeah, that's something I believe and understand, aren't necessarily understanding of the image of God. And so, yeah, this one I would say I know I'm the least familiar with, but people could feel free to look it up. Karl Barth, the theologian, as far as I understand, was someone that wrote at length about this view. And I'm sure it has some pros to it, but it seems like it kind of pushes against this idea that no matter what, people are made in the image of God. It seems to elevate more to there needs to be an awareness of your relationship with God to kind of hone in on what it means to be an image bearer. I don't know if you have thoughts on that view or.
Well, I have thoughts. I have questions because it's not hugely familiar to me. Although I have heard another kind of, I'll bring that up in a second, but my question is to clarify, does it mean that you're not really an image bearer until you're able to reflect and engage a relationship with God?
That's what I understand. And from my time at CBC, and in a class where we discussed some of these views, that was a major con of it was, what about infants and what about people that are due to disability unable to come to a place where that's something they can kind of autonomously understand for themselves? Would God just say, "Oh, you're not made in my image," and that seems like an obvious no, that's just not the way it is. So yeah, I think that is a con of it, that it came from what I understand, it came out of this time of the Enlightenment and this time of the kind of rationalization of the world and understanding, and science is being elevated, which are all good things, but got to this point, I think, of people that really are aware of that and understand it. That's where it's happening. That's kind of the highest quality of image bearers, is those kind of people and that kind of thinking. So, but it is a view out there.
Yeah, well, and it kind of, again, I haven't read widely on this, but it kind of makes me think that it emerged, as you're saying, Enlightenment thinking, scientific thinking, because it seems to fit well with an evolutionary kind of mindset, actually. For example, if you would hold to the view that some people have, that God didn't start with two human beings, but God started with an kind of an evolved grouping of humans, Homo sapiens, then eventually, somewhere through the evolutionary process, there has to be this image bearing that gets inserted, right? And that insertion is an awareness, a consciousness that humanity eventually evolves into. I can see maybe a possible some benefits to this in terms of
Mhm.
the way that we think, but overall, it just seems there's too many loose threads on that one.
Yeah, it's a little bit limiting, I would say.
Yeah.
So that's the second view, the relational view, and then the third one, which is a lot of what your sermon focuses on, is the functional view, and this view has come out from a lot of biblical theology, Old Testament theology, more and more. I think I'm not sure the date, but it's more recent. I think the substantive view was the view of the early church for centuries, and this functional view has kind of come in the last few hundred years more into focus. And essentially what it is the doing, that it's uh, bearing the image of God as being priests and rulers. There's a function to it. There's a purpose. Just like when you talk to a creation, it's not just that God created materials, but he gave them purpose. They are to do something, and they have a way of being and going about. So the functional view is it really focuses on this mandate to steward creation, to be fruitful and multiply, to cultivate, to create culture, and kind of develop a world around us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the functional view is one that the churches, you see it coming onto the scene more and more in sermons. And at Baker View, I think we're talking about these kind of ideas more right in this sermon series. So
Right.
yeah, I think it's a good one, and obviously it goes into our conversation here. But what I want to talk about, and maybe this is a broader conversation just about theological views, but I find myself saying, well, it's this one and substantive, like it's both, and it's not, oh, we only are functional, oh no, it's only the essence of us that are the image of God, that we need that balance there. So I think sometimes it's futile in theological discussions to just say one has to be the only right answer.
Well, especially, I totally agree. Especially when we give the category a name. As soon as we give a
Mm,
category a name, we limit what that category is capable of. So,
mm,
for example, as soon as we say functional view, then everything about that view just points to function and
right.
doesn't allow really for anything else. I can't remember now if it was N.T. Wright or if it was another whoever else I was reading. Maybe it's besides the point, but the Hebrew term image comes from the same word that idol comes from. And that might sound terribly strange, but we're essentially the idols of the
Mm,
world. We have to maybe think of idol as a more of a neutral term than a negative term in order to
right.
really make sure that this conversation works. But as idols, I mean, if you think about an idol, you create a statue or something, a carving, um,
Mm-hmm.
because it functions as the intermediary between you and creation and the gods, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you want to talk to the gods, you do it through an idol. Well, that's sort of kind of how God made us. The world is supposed to talk through us to get to God, kind of thing, and
Mm-hmm.
that's our priestly role, kind of thing. Um, so I don't find that what I explained or what N.T. Wright teaches on priests and rulers as strictly function. It's actually who we are. It is the essence of who we are. And
Mm-hmm.
so I agree. I maybe would just use slightly different language. I still think there's maybe something a little bit problematic about the substantive view because what do we actually mean when we say the essence? Like
Mm,
the physical essence, the breath of life.
mm-hmm.
There are other animals that have the breath of life, um, and other animals are physical and have somewhat of the same anatomy and makeup as human
Mm-hmm.
beings. So when we say substantive, like I'm not exactly sure what we totally
Yeah.
mean.
Well,
Uh,
let's talk a bit about that, because being that was the view of the church, and you can maybe argue still the predominant view in the Western church or even the global church of what it means to be an image bearer. It's still, even if we hold to the functional view, it's still more important that we have this essence of the image of God. And this leads into kind of the second part of our conversation. I was hoping we could have
Mm-hmm.
about this language of ruling and subduing and having dominion over all of creation. This mandate that humans have, and I think there is truth to this throughout Christian history that without a functional view of the image of God, we have not necessarily been at the front lines of the environmental um, fight or push to be people that are focusing on caring for the environment. That when we have a substantive view of the image of God, and we hold to that, like you're talking about, too strongly, it can be disconnected from our actual call to care for the earth. And we can read things like subdue and dominion and say, well, yeah, we can do that. We can just take what's ours, and this was a gift from God to us, and we can do whatever we want with it. And sadly, throughout the church history, you see Christians as people who have made destructive choices in the church as a whole that have not necessarily been helping the environment, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that and the translation of subdue? I know you talked a bit about that in your sermon as well.
Well, of course, this one can get away on us, and it has throughout history. It's dangerous language because of the translation of and how we've used that word in other contexts. We talking, some of the similar language in English would be Lord, Master, like these terms of ruling, and depending on what era you lived in, I mean. Lord can be a really gross word, especially when you use it in the context that Peter uses it in. Is it chapter 5 of First Peter, that you shouldn't be overseers that lord it over the Gentiles, right? So there it's being used in a negative way. We shouldn't be lording it over anyone. But these words also have narratives, history where things have been positive and where ruling is actually done in a positive way. We're terrible at telling those positive stories because I think the greater stories are the negative ones. How a dictator got carried away with power, and then we become anti-authoritarian and those kinds of things. But I find this view of the image of God, this I guess functional, if you want to categorize it, as at least partially our mandate to rule. And the way that seems to be spelled out in the Genesis text is more like take care of. It's to manage. It's not ours. We're not owners. We're stewards. We've been given a job to do. We haven't been given things to own or to keep. And so this mandate to steward seems to be for me something that shapes the way that I understand rule, not the other way around kind of thing or whatever. So are there people out there who won't like this view because they don't want to see humanity ruling the earth? Humanity has had their chance. They've messed it up royally. Let's return creation back to itself and just no, that's an incorrect kind of posture. I would see, let's return humanity back to a more true or authentic way of expressing what it means to rule by stewardship. So I unpacked the word subdue in my sermon because I think that one is a trip word for me more than ruling is for me. Maybe it's different for everybody. But to bring under submission seems like such a negative thing, but it really isn't. We do it all the time. We make sure we control our environment, not to be destructive or I don't know, to bring things lower than yourself. It's actually to grow things. It's to care for things, and it's to steward them. And so I'm trying to shape in my own mind and heart a more positive view of what it means to subdue.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's important that that's the language that's there, and we can't totally get around it, but we do need to see it in that light and kind of reframe it. And I think this kind of tension between focusing on caring for the environment and kind of using the environment for our own gain, because no matter what, no matter how sustainable we want to be, to build houses and to eat food and to create a world around us, we are going to use it. The answer is not to just do nothing with the resources that we have,
Right.
but there needs to be a tension there, and there is. Like one of the first examples that comes to my mind is the pipeline here in Canada, and you can easily see the tension between valuing the economy and valuing the environment, and it's maybe not super helpful to frame it this way, but a lot of people saying, oh well, this is what's good for the economy, is really, this is what's good for humans, this is what will make life better for us, and aren't we supposed to be the ones making these kind of decisions? And I don't have a definitive answer on all of that, but I would hope both sides feel the tension. That I think it's the instant we get too easy and say the environment isn't even a variable in the equation. Whatever's best for us as humans and the economy is what we should do, and vice versa. Although we rarely sit here, but saying, "Oh, it's only about the environment; it's not about humans." There is a balance that we need to find there. And so I'm wondering, Jeff, as the church and as people, like, what are some ways, how do we find ourselves kind of factoring environmental impact as an equation in our lives? Like, how do we become more aware of that it's something that in a lot of ways we feel disconnected from in our lives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would begin by saying that the church needs to start thinking positively about science. I think science and scientists can get viewed quickly as those who are opposing all of the conservative views of God and his world and the Bible and those kinds of things. And it's simply not true. Science in and of itself is simply a way of knowing. It's a way of knowing by breaking our understanding down and collecting the data and then reproducing it and creating hypotheses. These are good things to do, and we should be doing them. And the church needs to listen to scientists, and they need to listen to scientific evidence, because it's a way of knowing. And if there's any group of people in this world that should be all about a way of knowing, it's the church. God gave us this world. We should try to know it and understand it. I think actually that's even a part of stewarding it. You can't steward something that you don't know, right? And so we should trust scientists. The tricky part of it is when there is debate about the science, right? So like, let's take your pipeline example. It's not confusing because it's all of the scientific body of knowledge versus liberal left green people who just won't have anything. There's actually conflicting science about what exactly will be the impact that this may or may not have on the earth in various ways, kind of thing. And so we can be suspect of competing sciences. Then we need to critique and be careful and have good conversation. But when things are clear, we should allow that. I mean, I think there's governments in our world right now that are in big trouble because they just haven't listened to scientists, and that's a big problem. So we can be Bible believing people, and even somewhat conservative in our understanding of the world and things. And we can still respect the voices that don't necessarily have to contradict everything that we believe, but that can inform us and that can help us see a different path. Part of this too is actually a bit of a challenge up against our theology that we sometimes call eschatology. It's what we think is going to happen in the end. And if we think what's going to happen in the end is God's going to come, rescue the Christians, and obliterate all of creation, well, then to use up creation without much care of what's left at the end, it's not really a big deal.
Yeah.
But if you have a view that God is, as in Revelation, God's going to sort of renew his creation, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and God will come to earth and dwell with humankind. Well, then there's something to preserve here. There's something to care for, and I think that makes our task more difficult, but and challenging. But it does point us in the direction of living in this tension. So whether it's the pipeline or whether it's other kinds of environmental struggles that we have, we should live in that tension. I wouldn't want to live in a world that didn't have a voice from those who care about everything environmentally, don't really care about the progress of humanity or anything, that they just care about the fact that trees and grass are growing. I don't want to wipe that voice out. We need that voice. But we also need the tension of people who are creating economy and creating realms for humanity to work in, which to me is kind of like a creation account type of language, is to create the space and then to fill it, as I preached on 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's good wisdom in that we need to hear those voices on both sides. But I think, especially with environmental issues, I see, and myself included, it's only been the last few years, Brittany and I have tried to be more intentional in thinking about these issues and our own impact on the environment and how that connects. That's not just a personal choice, but it connects to what it means to be human and to disciple and follow Jesus. But it's easy to kind of take a passive stance. Like, I don't think a lot of people would say they're against the environment and they want to use up all the resources and they want to destroy it.
Yeah.
And what irks people, I think, is when you see protests or people that are all about the environment, they're kind of telling everyone, you are destroying it. You are one of those people, even if you don't think you are, by using this kind of car, by caring about a pipeline, by flying, by buying things at this store, like all of those things. And it can really be this guilt driving, like, you need to be aware that you are someone that's doing that. And that doesn't feel good. It just doesn't feel good to be told you're doing something wrong, especially when you don't, it's not something you think about. But I think when done graciously, we do have to kind of sit in that a little bit, and maybe even lament that, man, my life, just by being someone now, I am having negative impacts on the environment by driving and doing this. And that's okay, in the sense that we don't need to feel ashamed, and we don't have to go and flip our life around and instantly become like an environmentalist hippie kind of caricature that we think of.
Right.
I think to just look at places you can actively be making choices that are helping the environment or are being less negative, that there's incremental change is incredibly important and should be celebrated. That it's not about doing more and you're never doing enough and you need to become full on just all about the environment, but just thinking about, oh, I should be composting, or I should be doing this. Where do I buy my clothing? I'm going to do some research and think about the clothing industry and the impacts it has on the environment. And taking those steps incrementally, I think, is a great way to just start taking some active action into this issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. We don't want to create more anxiety than we already have in our society of, wow, you're really living in such a way that you're contributing way more to the negative impact on the earth than everybody else, kind of thing. So incremental steps, as you become aware of them, I think are helpful. Another helpful approach is just our mindset. So we're collectively, by being born into Canada during this era, we're collectively participating in the negative, whether you like it or not.
Mhm.
To some degree, you got your food, your clothes, or your house, or something like that, because someone didn't get paid enough, or it didn't get mined or resourced out of the earth in a healthy way, kind of thing, and you're benefiting from it. So in a sense, we're collectively guilty as soon as we're born, and are
Mhm.
benefiting from these things. But we're also collectively a part of a community that's trying to redeem it. And so
Mhm.
let's not just think so negatively about, oh, you're participating. We're also collectively participating in the good. And so those voices, for example, where even if I didn't have that voice, even if I did never wrote an article or went on the radio or made a TV commercial or anything like that, but there's this voice out there that pushes back on unfair working environments, unfair pay, all those kinds of things.
Mhm.
Well, I'm collectively a part of that voice, and so when someone, and I don't know where it started, for example, started talking about fair trade coffee,
Mhm.
how many people are working in various countries like Colombia,
Mhm.
and are working under slavery conditions? Well,
Mhm.
I can guarantee you that's probably still happening. But have we revolutionized the coffee industry by expressing fair trade, and even making the giant corporations that bring coffee beans by mass, pushing them to even increase the conditions by which
Mhm.
they're bringing over these kinds of goods? Yeah, we are. That voice is an important voice. And
Mhm.
we might think that, oh, it's just the local corner store that sells fair trade coffee, everybody else sells the regular coffee. Yeah, but the regular coffee has been pushed to higher the standards might not even be high enough yet, but they've been
Mhm.
pushed to raise their standards. Those voices, I'm a part of that, you're a part of that, and we can celebrate that kind of thing, because
Mhm.
that voice is also a part of the stewardship that we're called to,
Yeah.
of our subduing.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point to kind of wrap up what everything we've been saying, because something like that, a simple thing of researching, if you love coffee, and researching where your coffee's coming from, because it is coming from somewhere else. It's in a nice little bag and at Save On for you, but it sounds dumb to even mention, but that got there through a lot of steps,
Yeah.
and to be informed on that. What that does, you're talking about this fair trade coffee, it brings environmental sustainability. So it's good for the environment. So we're talking about, we have a mandate to steward the earth. So a very small but practical step, caring about your coffee, can help steward the earth better. It'll still have some negative impact, but like, yeah, to be encouraged by that you're taking a step. But it also goes back to our understanding of every human is made in the image of God. And when we really hold on to that and become more aware of that, and we realize us buying this bag of coffee, even though if it feels so far away, has an impact on another human life, or the clothing you buy or anything, the more you can sit and see the amount of love that God has for other people and everyone made in his image, to know that you all can affect other lives indirectly in that way, even if you never meet them,
Yeah.
uh, is something we need to wrestle with and become aware of. Because then, when you're buying fair trade coffee or making a choice, a better choice like that, you're dignifying another human. You're telling that person in Colombia that owns that farm, you're worth a normal wage. You're worth having a better quality of life. And yeah, you might not be there meeting them, shaking their hand, and telling them that,
Yeah.
but we need to see that connection, that we can make those kind of changes. And so these things dignify human life, and they help care for creation. These practical choices. So I think that's a beautiful way just to kind of frame it.
I'll add one more thing. So in all of this, I think maybe a critique or a pushback can be, uh, uh, the argument isn't strong enough if it's simply saying we should do a better job of making the earth last longer, kind of thing.
Mm,
We should steward it so that, and also that it gives dignity to people, and it helps people grow, and that kind of thing. this also, when we do these kinds of things, so if we didn't do those kinds of things, our mindset would continue to entrench, and it would form our hearts and our minds into, to develop us into the kind of people who say things are here for us to use up.
Mm-hmm.
When we don't, when we're having the voice that you're just articulated here in your summary, it, even if it's not just for making sure the earth lasts longer, what it does when we do these kinds of things, when we have these kind of conversations, is it develops our minds and our hearts to think differently.
Mm.
And that's a part of being created in the image of God. We have that ability to say, who does God want us to be, as well as do, back to that being and doing tension. And so when we don't care, when we pillage and exploit, it actually develops our hearts and minds in the wrong way.
Mm.
But when we are caring and stewarding, we actually become more of the people that we were supposed to become. And I think that this is even God's way of exercising us into maturity.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great piece to leave us off with, to think about. Even these conversations without even taking action is an important step. I totally true that this is a lifelong journey, and we just need to continue to shape ourselves, and build ourselves up with those kind of conversations that are about love and God's kingdom and participating in all of that, His great creation project,
Yeah.
as you said. So I think that's a great encouragement. Next week, the sermon in the series, Pastor Carey is bringing it, and we are jumping to the end of Genesis, to the story of Joseph. So you can look forward to that. We'll have a springboard about Carey's sermon, talking further about the story of Joseph and its connection to this whole conversation about life and work and rest and play. So yeah, I encourage you to tune in this weekend for that. Thank you again for listening and watching. And yeah, we just love to have these conversations with you. So again, if you have any questions or comments, email us, text us, let us know. We really enjoy doing these, and we hope that they're benefiting you. And yeah, so just thanks again for supporting and listening. Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.